Looking at old photographs from the 19th century, something feels profoundly wrong. We see magnificent cities with grand boulevards, ornate architecture, and perfectly planned infrastructure. The buildings are there, imposing and beautiful. But something crucial is missing. Life itself. The streets are empty. The squares are silent. Entire metropolises appear frozen, as if waiting for inhabitants who never came. And then, suddenly, they did come. Trainloads of them. Children. Tens of thousands of orphaned children, shipped across continents, given new names, new families, new lives. Their pasts erased as if they never existed. We're told this was charity, a humanitarian effort to save destitute children from the slums. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the orphan trains were something else entirely? What if they were the final piece of a massive puzzle, the human element needed to complete a global operation we now call the Great Reset? Between 1854 and 1929, approximately 250,000 children were loaded onto trains in New York City and sent westward to new families across America. They called it the Orphan Train movement, and it's described in history books as one of the largest child migration programs ever undertaken. Charitable organizations, primarily the Children's Aid Society and the New York Foundling Hospital, organized this mass relocation. The official story is simple. Overcrowded orphanages in eastern cities needed relief, and farming families in the developing West needed extra hands. It seemed like a perfect solution. But here's where things start to unravel. Most of these children weren't actually orphans. Records show that fewer than half had lost both parents. In fact, as many as 25% of the children on those trains had both mother and father still alive. So why were they being shipped away like cargo? Why were families being torn apart on such a massive scale? The process itself was disturbing. Children would be gathered from orphanages and city streets, cleaned up, dressed in new clothes, and given a Bible. Then they'd board the train, often with nothing but a number pinned to their chest. The train would stop at various towns along the route, and local newspapers would advertise the arrival. Townspeople would gather, and the children would be brought out, sometimes literally put on stage. Prospective parents would inspect them, checking their teeth like livestock, feeling their muscles, asking them to perform tasks or sing songs. One reporter in 1912 described the scene with unsettling casualness. People ordered children with specific traits. Some wanted boys, others girls. Some preferred light babies, others dark. The orders were filled out properly, and everyone left delighted with the healthy, pretty children they'd acquired. Another account mentions how people came along and prodded them, looked and felt, and saw how many teeth they had. This wasn't adoption in any modern sense. This was selection. And once selected, a child's past was effectively erased. Many were given new names by their adoptive families, especially if their original names sounded too foreign, too Irish, too Italian, too Jewish. Siblings were routinely separated if a family only wanted one child. Letters back to the orphanages were rare and filtered through the organization. There was little to no follow-up to ensure these children were being treated well. The outcomes varied wildly. Some children did find loving homes and opportunities they never would have had in the city, but many others became indentured servants, little more than unpaid farmhands, receiving food and shelter but no education, no affection, and certainly no family. Contemporary reports openly acknowledged that many children were used as strictly slave farm labor. So we return to the question, why? Why were there so many children available for this program? The official explanation points to poverty, disease, and immigration. New York in the mid-1800s was indeed overcrowded with immigrants fleeing famine and hardship in Europe. Epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and yellow fever regularly swept through the tenements, leaving children parentless. The Civil War created more orphans. All of this is documented and true. But the scale is what doesn't add up. By the 1850s, observers estimated between 10,000 and 30,000 homeless children in New York City alone, out of a total population of about 500,000. That's an astonishing percentage. And this wasn't just an American phenomenon. Britain was running a parallel program called the Home Children Scheme, which sent over 100,000 children from the UK to Canada, Australia, and other colonies between 1869 and the 1930s. Here's the disturbing part. Only about 12% of those British children were actual orphans. The rest were taken from impoverished families, often under false pretenses or outright coercion. In Scotland alone, at least 15,000 children were shipped to Canada from the 1860s all the way into the 1970s. Many were told their parents were dead when they weren't. Many parents were told this was temporary when it was permanent. This was forced removal dressed up as charity, and it was happening simultaneously across the Western world. Why this coordinated global-scale movement of children? Why at this specific point in history? To answer that, we need to look at what else was happening in the mid-19th century, and that's where the story becomes truly unsettling. There's a theory, dismissed by mainstream historians but supported by a growing body of photographic and architectural evidence, that something catastrophic happened to our world sometime between the early 1800s and 1860s. Something that killed off much of the adult population, buried cities under mud and debris, and necessitated a complete repopulation and reconstruction of civilization as we know it. Look at photographs from the 1860s and 1870s of major cities like St. Petersburg, Paris, New York, and San Francisco. You'll see something strange. The buildings are there, grand and ornate, but the streets are empty. Not just a few people missing, but completely devoid of life. No crowds, no market stalls, no horses tied to posts, no carts, no street vendors. Nothing. The standard explanation is that early photography required long exposure times, so moving people didn't register on the film. But that doesn't explain everything. Where are the stationary elements of city life? Where are the stacks of firewood piled against houses for heating? Where are the barrels and crates of goods waiting to be delivered? Where are the horses standing at hitching posts? Where are the vendors at their stalls, which should be stationary? Most tellingly, where is the smoke from chimneys? Look closely at these photographs. You'll see hundreds, sometimes thousands of chimneys on the rooftops. Every building heated with fire, every kitchen cooked with fire. Yet in photograph after photograph, not a single plume of smoke rises from any chimney. The sky is perfectly clear. For every stove in every building in an entire city to be unlit at the same moment is statistically impossible unless those buildings are empty, unless the city is abandoned. And there's more. Many buildings in these photographs show something peculiar. Doors and windows that lead directly into the ground, or are half buried under several feet of earth. The official explanation is the cultural layer, the idea that over centuries debris and soil gradually accumulated, raising street levels. But these photos show buildings buried up to their second floors in what appears to be fresh mud and clay, not centuries of accumulated debris. In Kansas City, photographs from 1867 show massive stone buildings covered on their sides by soil to the height of 2 full floors, about 23 feet of dense clay and earth. In Seattle, old photos revealed giant cliffs of earth rising in the middle of the city, with houses perched on top and other buildings standing at their base as if they'd been excavated from the ground. The city engineers even called them glacial hills, a term that's more revealing than they perhaps intended. What if we take that term literally? What if these weren't ancient geological formations, but recent deposits? What if something had indeed buried these cities, and the 19th century populations we see in later photographs were actually engaged in a massive dig-out operation? The evidence doesn't stop there. Across Europe, from Italy to Russia, artists from the mid-18th and early 19th centuries depicted the same haunting scene. Majestic cities, castles, and ancient structures buried under thick layers of clay and earth. Giovanni Battista Piranesi's engravings from the 1750s show Rome with buildings submerged deep underground, people walking at levels that would be several stories high today. Russian painter Fyodor Matveev's work from the end of that century shows Italian cities on hills flooded with streams of clay, clearly having come from above, flowing down slopes and burying lower floors. These weren't artistic fantasies. These artists were documentarians of their time, recording what they actually saw. And what they saw was a world still recovering from disaster. Now let's tie this back to the Orphans. If something catastrophic did occur, a mud flood, a series of cataclysmic storms, a global climate disaster, perhaps even a war using technologies we're not told about, what would be the result? Massive death toll, particularly among adults, cities buried or damaged, infrastructure destroyed. But children, being smaller, more adaptable, and often hidden away during disasters, would have a higher survival rate. This would explain the sudden, inexplicable surplus of orphaned children. Not because of normal disease and poverty, but because something had killed their parents on a scale history doesn't openly acknowledge. Consider this scenario. A disaster strikes. The adult population of cities and towns is decimated. Children survive in larger numbers but are now without parents, without homes, without any connection to the past. The infrastructure, the buildings, the streets, the grand architecture is still there, but buried or damaged. It needs to be excavated, cleaned, repaired. It needs to be populated. What better way to populate these recovered cities than with children who have no memory of what came before? Children are blank slates. They can be told anything about the past, given any history, any cultural narrative. They have no parents to contradict the official story, no grandparents to pass down memories of the old world. They can be dispersed across the continent, given new names, new families, new identities. In one generation, you can completely erase any collective memory of what actually happened. This is exactly what the Orphan Trains accomplished. 250,000 children in America alone, sent to all corners of the growing nation. Their identities erased, their pasts severed, their memories of origin eliminated. They grew up believing whatever they were told by their adoptive families, by their teachers, by their pastors. They had no reason to question the official narrative because they had no alternative framework, no family history to compare it to. One conspiracy researcher puts it bluntly, if you kill all the people of the land, you can erase entire nations and then move other peoples in, such as trains full of orphans, and then set them about to rebuilding the place. They will grow up in a foreign land that they will come to call home. The language and history that was once there will be replaced by whatever comes after. This wasn't just happening in America. The British Home Children Program was doing the same thing throughout the British Empire. France had similar programs. Russia had its own orphan redistribution systems. It was global, it was coordinated. And it happened to coincide perfectly with the period when cities were being regraded, when mud hills were being removed, when cultural layers were being excavated. Let's look at some disturbing cultural artifacts from this era. In the early 1900s, a bizarre genre of postcards appeared across Europe and America, thousands of them depicting surreal scenes of babies. But these weren't normal baby pictures. They showed infants growing in cabbage patches, being harvested like crops, babies hatching from eggs, babies being transported in baskets on trains and ships, babies floating in shells on water. Most disturbing are the captions, written in French but distributed internationally. À vendre, for sale. One postcard shows a fairground with a sign reading Modern Baby Bazaar, with the terms listed below. Free entry. We fear no competition. Everything is for sale. And at the bottom, "We do not accept returns." Other postcards show babies in baskets, each with a caption like a product description. "I will be good." "I won't wet the bed." "I am cheerful." "I will love you." "I am cute." This is advertising. This is a catalogue. These cards were sent through the mail, traded and collected. They weren't hidden or secret. They were normalized, made into something quaint and charming. But what were they really depicting? The conspiracy theory suggests these postcards were documentation, perhaps even instruction manuals, for a massive child redistribution system. The Cabbage Patch imagery might have been code for mass production or cultivation of children. The trains and ships depicted weren't metaphorical. They were the actual orphan trains and immigrant ships carrying children across continents. This imagery didn't disappear. It resurfaced in the 1980s with the Cabbage Patch Kids phenomenon. Children would adopt these dolls, which came with fake adoption papers. Special stores had employees dressed as nurses who would pull dolls from a cabbage patch and hand them to kids in an adoption ceremony. It was marketed as innocent fun, but the symbolism is identical to those unsettling 19th century postcards. Was this cultural memory resurfacing? Was someone who knew the real history encoding it into popular culture? The Orphan Train program had another disturbing aspect that's often overlooked: the involvement of secretive fraternal organizations. The Independent Order of Odd Fellows, a powerful fraternal society in the 19th century, ran multiple orphan asylums across America. Why was a secretive fraternity so invested in orphans? What was their interest in these children with no past, no family, no connections? The same question applies to the heavy involvement of religious organizations. The Catholic Church ran the New York Foundling Hospital, which sent out baby trains carrying infants and toddlers. Protestant organizations ran the Children's Aid Society. There was even tension between them. Catholics accused Protestants of stealing Catholic children to raise them Protestant, and vice versa. But both were participating in the same system: the mass redistribution of children across the continent. Were these organizations merely charitable, or were they implementing something larger? Were they the administrative arms of a repopulation program? Consider the logistics. To place 250,000 children required an enormous infrastructure. Orphanages had to be built or expanded. Transportation had to be arranged and paid for. Advertising had to be placed in newspapers across dozens of states. Local committees had to be organized in hundreds of towns to receive the children and vet potential families. This wasn't the work of a few kind-hearted ministers. This was a coordinated operation on a scale that suggests government or institutional backing. And it worked. Within one generation, these children had fully integrated into American society. They had no memory of being anything other than Americans. If they came from families that spoke German, Irish, Italian, or Polish, that language was lost. If their parents had been Catholics from Ireland, and they were placed with Protestant farmers in Kansas, that religious identity was lost. Everything that connected them to their origins was systematically severed. This is what makes the Orphan Trains such a perfect tool for a great reset. If you want to rebuild a civilization, you need people. But you especially need young people who can be shaped, who can be taught a new history, a new culture, a new identity. You need people who won't ask questions about inconsistencies in the timeline because they have no alternative information to compare it to. Let's examine the timeline more carefully. The Orphan Train program began in 1854. What else was happening around that time? The 1850s saw massive waves of immigration to America, but also strange depopulation in some areas. The California gold rush of 1849 drew hundreds of thousands west, but many of those early settlers vanished from records. Entire mining towns were established and then abandoned within years. The 1860s brought the Civil War, which we're told killed 600,000 to 750,000 people. But some researchers have questioned those numbers. noting inconsistencies in battle reports and death records. What if the real death toll was higher? What if there were other causes of death beyond battle that aren't discussed in standard histories? The 1870s saw the Great Chicago Fire, the Great Boston Fire, massive fires in San Francisco, Portland, and dozens of other American cities. Europe experienced similar waves of urban destruction. Constantinople burned, Hamburg burned. Major fires seemed to sweep through cities worldwide with suspicious timing and scale. Were these natural disasters or something else? Were they part of a cleanup operation, destroying evidence of the prior world? By the 1880s and 1890s, the cities had been rebuilt, repopulated, and the new generation, many of them orphan train riders, were coming of age, having families of their own, passing down the history they'd been taught. The reset was complete, but there are cracks in the narrative. There are too many orphan train riders who, late in life, began asking questions about their origins and hit walls. Too many who discovered late in life that the story they'd been told about their parents being dead wasn't true. Too many who found siblings they never knew existed, separated by the system and given different names. There are too many architectural anomalies that don't fit the timeline we're given. Buildings supposedly constructed in the 1860s that show signs of being much older, or conversely, ancient buildings that we're told are from the 1800s. The technology required to build some of these structures, the precise stonework, the massive scale, the engineering sophistication, seems beyond what should have been possible for the era. There are too many photographs of empty cities and buried buildings, too many accounts from the era of excavating and regrading that involved removing millions of tons of earth from city centers with primitive equipment. Too many references to taming the terrain and removing glacial hills and lowering street levels that seem to involve far more work than simple urban planning would require. And there are too many orphans. The numbers don't add up when you actually calculate what it would take to produce that many parentless children through normal means. Even accounting for disease, poverty, and war, the scale is unprecedented before or since. What if we've been looking at this wrong? What if the official history, industrialization, immigration, westward expansion, the rise of American power, is true, but incomplete? What if it's the story of what came after, but not the story of what came before? What if there was a previous civilization, more advanced than we're told, that built these magnificent structures we attribute to the 19th century? What if something destroyed that civilization, buried its cities, killed most of its people? What if the survivors, or the victors, depending on who caused the catastrophe, needed to repopulate and rebuild quickly, but couldn't allow knowledge of the previous world to survive? The orphan trains would be the perfect solution. You have the architecture, the infrastructure, the cities. They just need people. But not people with memories, not people with connections to what came before. You need a new generation, blank slate teens, who will grow up accepting whatever reality you construct for them. This is why the children were stripped of their names, their languages, their family connections. This is why there was little to no follow-up to ensure they maintained any link to their past. This is why the whole system was designed to sever and erase rather than preserve and document. Because the point wasn't to help children. The point was to create a new population with no knowledge of the previous world. And it worked beautifully. Within 2 generations, the memory of whatever happened in the early 19th century was almost completely erased. The orphan train riders' children and grandchildren grew up fully American, fully integrated, with no stories from their grandparents about the old country or the old ways, because their grandparents didn't have those stories. The chain of memory was broken. This is the power of using children in a reset operation. Adults can be conquered, but they remember. They resist. They tell stories of how things used to be. But children adapt. Children accept. Children become. Today, if you suggest that something catastrophic happened in the 1800s that history books don't tell us about, you'll be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. The evidence is called coincidence, the patterns are called confirmation bias, the anomalies are explained away. But the evidence is there if you look. The buried buildings are real. The empty city photographs are real. The orphan trains are real. The postcards are real. The sheer scale of child relocation across the Western world is real. What we're being asked to believe is that all of these things happened independently, for normal, explainable reasons, with no connection to each other. We're asked to accept that hundreds of thousands of children just happened to be available for relocation at exactly the time when cities just happened to be undergoing massive reconstruction, at exactly the time when there just happened to be empty lands needing population, at exactly the time when there just happened to be a push to erase ethnic and cultural identities in favor of new national identities. Or perhaps there's a simpler explanation. Perhaps something happened that killed a lot of people and buried a lot of cities. Perhaps the survivors or the victors needed to repopulate quickly. Perhaps they needed that new population to have no memory of what came before. And perhaps the orphan trains were how they did it. The children who rode those trains are almost all gone now. The last survivors are in their 90s if they're still alive. Soon there will be no one left who experienced it firsthand. Their stories, what few were recorded, speak of confusion, loss, and a strange feeling of being disconnected from history. Many spent their whole lives searching for their origins, for siblings, for some explanation of who they really were. They were told they were nobody, that their parents abandoned them or died in circumstances no one could quite explain. They were told to be grateful for their new families, their new names, their new lives. They were told the past didn't matter, and most believed it because what choice did they have? But what if they weren't nobody? What if they were the children of a previous world, a world that's been hidden from us? What if their erasure was necessary to complete the greatest historical cover-up of all time? The orphan trains weren't just a social program. They were the final act of the Great Reset, the repopulation phase, the moment when the new world was filled with people who would never question the old one because they had no memory of it. They were how you complete a civilizational reboot. You don't just destroy the old and build the new. You create a population that believes the new is all there ever was, and we are their descendants. We are living in the world they built, believing the story they were told, accepting the timeline we've been given, but the evidence remains, waiting for those willing to look. The buried buildings, the empty cities, the suspicious fires, the mass child relocations, the erased identities, all of it pointing to one conclusion. Something happened to our world in the 19th century. Something we're not supposed to know about. Something that required the most elaborate cover-up in human history. The orphan trains carried more than children. They carried the future of the reset, the next generation who would never know what was lost, never know what was taken, never know to ask the questions that might unravel the whole construct. They were, in every sense, the orphans of a hidden history. And perhaps we all are.